shall we begin? I'd like to thank everyone for coming today to hear Jessica Zukovic, who we are delighted to have joining us at CREASE virtually from Alberta. And I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the Palij family, whose very generous gift to our Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies allows us to continue our exploration of Ukrainian studies. My name is Eric Scott. I'm the director of KU's CREASE, and I'm very happy to introduce today Jessica Zukovic. Jessica is the author of a new book, Superfluous Women, Feminism, Art, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine, which was published by University of Toronto Press in 2020. She is currently based at the University of Alberta, where she is a postdoctoral scholar for the Contemporary Ukrainian Program. She has received numerous awards for her scholarship, including a Fulbright Scholarship to Ukraine. She has taught in Kiev. She has served as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. And she received her PhD from the University of Michigan in 2016. Today, she'll be talking about the intersection of gender, culture, and revolution in Ukraine. And also, I'm judging from the title of her talk, examining these issues from a transatlantic perspective. So we are very happy to have her here today. And I also want to mention the guiding suggestion here of Vitaly Chernetsky, who brought Jessica's work to my attention. She will talk for about 45 minutes. I will then open things up for questions. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat at any time, and we will get to them as soon as she is done with her presentation. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Jessica Zukovic, who will be presenting to us on her latest research. And I will also be sharing in the chat a link to her book in case you'd like to buy a copy. I highly recommend it. It's a really exciting read on a very relevant topic.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is my pleasure to be here today, and greetings to the snowy south from the snowy north. I hope everyone listening is safe, and my regards to anybody who has maybe lost someone to the COVID pandemic. So we are saving lives by meeting virtually, and also the planet because of our carbon footprint that we're not making today. Without further ado, this talk is really an exciting occasion today for me for a few reasons. There is quite a bit of significance to today. As many of you already know, today is the official day of remembrance of the Maidan Revolution in 2014, in which many on the Maidan lost their lives in tragic clashes with the law enforcement Berkut forces at that time. February 18 has since been marked by significant memorials happening in Ukraine. And I'm sure if those of you tune in today to Ukraine media, you will find a large discussion of that. Today, I will focus our attention backwards and forwards, moving in time between the two revolutions of 2004, the Orange Revolution, and 2014, and reflecting also into the present, where we are now and what those experiences have meant for my interlocutors in Ukraine that I've kept friendships and also professional relations, colleagues over many years. I have really taken an approach of a translator between Ukraine and the United States, and now Canada, where I am seated in the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Today also happens to be my birthday, but more relevant to our discussion, it is also the birthday of Audre Lorde, the great American thinker and activist, who also happened to be a feminist and a Black woman. Her famous question, rooted in the injustices of the history of slavery in the United States, continues to offer all of us working today in any field profound insight into not only projects of emancipation or freedom of speech or academic freedom, or the development of social movements for those of us who maybe are studying culture, civil society, or political science and area studies, but of the central ideas and tenets of our societies in which we live, toil, and come to inhabit the narratives that we internalize, that define us. She asked, can one dismantle the master's house with the tools of the master? I will utilize our time together today to think not just about Ukraine's democracy in the context of revolution, but on ourselves, on the possibility potentially of some willful blindnesses in our field of vision in Ukrainian studies in the West that maybe too much tend to section out, even unknowingly, gender studies or critical race studies, which has come under attack by anti-gender movements, which I will talk about later. Sometimes failing to see that the authoritarianism and populism campaigns we might be studying in a different part of the world than we are geographically located are built as reactionary instruments and semantic backlash to gender. This is becoming brutally clear in the fact of feminist and women's protests in Poland and Belarus, but it is not new, especially since 2013, when the term "stop gender" was appearing in protests in the Polish press. And the word gender actually appeared more than any other single word that year in Polish media. So today, looking back on the reflections from my book, which really represents over a decade of ongoing research, sustainably looking at these terminologies and vocabularies, I'm going to give you a kind of overview and a taste of the firsthand interviews, the archival documents, the visual material, the historical context, and theoretical frameworks in which I've chosen to translate and communicate the unique story of a generation of feminists, artists, activists, intellectuals who I would consider my peers. This is by no means a comprehensive story of all generations of Ukraine, and deliberately so, because I think that this generation in their 30s who grew up between, and 20s who grew up between the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution have a unique perspective that is worth, and a unique language that is worth thinking about more deeply. Their ideas and culture making were and continue to be forged in the paradigm of this decade, this tumultuous decade between the two most recent revolutions of the 2000s in Ukraine. Gender and sexuality are at the forefront of these activist experimentations with the body and public space. Circulated also online, but locally rooted in a discourse that goes back to the 18th century, even earlier to the Baroque, in Ukrainian, not only, but also Polish, Russian, and Soviet aesthetics layered over one another, Jewish included, all of these comparative frameworks in the territories that make up modern Ukraine today. Mapping out several key historical changes in independent Ukraine in the book, I identify and trace the links across eras that the generation today is referring to most often in their work, kind of making it a comprehensive one, again, centering on the body, gender, and sexuality as signifiers for a range of human rights discourses that drive social relations, politics, and international human rights discourse today. So I would like to share my screen so that I can show you some of the visual material. I will just turn, see. So here you have an image of the Maidan memorials from 2018, in which on the right you can see individuals are looking at prototypes for the next Maidan museum. And the reason I have chosen to include this is because along with the centrality of a museum and the memorialization happening through institutions, there's also been quite a bit of attention on the Maidan Revolution being, a site where social media use really skyrocketed, and whether or not social media has been good for civil society is a separate question. But here in the central image, you can see large metal stanchions that have been permanently installed on the space of the Maidan, each one of them containing photos and posts that activists and demonstrators had posted. So their experiences in 2013, 2014 here are represented on these large metal stanchions, and not all of the posts are from well-known public figures. Some of them are from unknown everyday people that maybe didn't have an active role in politics or an institution that would exert pressure on some of the demands that protesters were making on the Maidan at that time, which included a response to the anti-discrimination law, which had not been signed by then President Yanukovych before the revolution. And that particular law would have impacted some of the legislation that has since been passed. The anti-discrimination law was passed in late 2017, but this guarantees on paper, whether or not it's enforced, we will think about later. This guarantees, more equality for women and gender minorities in society. So the space of the Maidan is still one that is highly contested symbolically, and you can see here also materially today in different installations that are moving towards a kind of consensus, or at least attempting to move to a consensus on what Maidan meant, because you also had in Ukraine anti-Maidan demonstrations. And as with other countries in the world in the last 5 years since Maidan, there's been a rise of the far right, which political scientist Lucan Way, who I largely concur with on questions concerning authoritarianism and stability of authoritarianism in Ukraine, argues that the rise of the far right in Ukraine indicates that Ukraine has become a quote unquote normalized Western country. That ironically, this very negative development for civil society, for moderate discussion, it makes Ukraine part of the West, ironically. So that is something that I want to think about in the context of anti-gender campaigns, or why we as scholars need to rebalance and center our discourse about gender as something very central and integral to what we are doing when we study Ukraine in the traditional disciplines, that we shouldn't have gender studies be something supplemental that we add on to our publications, but that the rhetoric the far right is using and the dissemination of post-fact media, when we look very closely, the language, the semantics, it shows us that gender actually is so central to today's formation of political identities. this is an image from the same site. This is the Maidan in 2014, May 1st, when I was able to visit. It happened to be Easter that day, so there were memorials already appearing on the Maidan, and priests were taking part in delivering the sacrament and different kind of ritualistic sorts of, activities around the Maidan. But what this particular message spelled out on the square here says is, stop propaganda. There is no fascism here. Patriotism is the idea of the Maidan. And the arrangement of these upturned cobblestones that had been taken from the barricades and painted and put here in the colors red, and then the colors of the Ukrainian flag, blue and yellow, are clearly designed for satellite cameras to circulate in media, possibly international media. It's a kind of message in a bottle effect where we, looking back on this now, can see so clearly how much Ukraine really has been on the front line of the information war and the, stop and the fake news, and that this crossroads of the Maidan is an important place to revisit. And doing that through the stories of activists, largely marginalized activists in the circles of gender equality and LGBT rights discourse that I've been working on, tells a smaller story than the big capital politics with a capital P, but it's a central story to what everyday people in Ukraine are experiencing. This is an image from the artist Vlada Ralko. She is a painter, and she created about 370 paintings of the Maidan and her experiences there in 2014. It's called Kiev Diary, Kievsky Shodenik. And what I think is also very interesting is that she created these in Kaniv, which is the birthplace of the national poet of Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko. And if you look at the drawings of Taras Shevchenko, some of the aesthetics are similar to her sketches, and she really does include in a lot of her works the landscapes, the horizons around the geography of Kiev and along, the river Dnipro, as Taras Shevchenko was doing. And Taras Shevchenko was also writing about, women in the villages of Ukraine. He was very angry, actually, about poverty and illiteracy in Ukraine. And I cite him, I include some of his poems in my book. And I also am thinking a little bit here about, again, the centrality throughout time, that there is a continuity to the links between gender and nation, and that we tend to, as gender theorists, now we tend to debate whether we are entering a fourth wave of feminist activism or whether we are still grappling with the post-feminist moment. I'm thinking of the work of Nicola Rivers, whose book, Fourth Wave Feminism, Turning Tides, she just published not too long ago. And in this book, she argues that the diversity of views are an asset. And remember, this particular moment of the Maidan started because of access to disbelief in the equal access to the ballot box and the legitimacy of the election results having been tampered with, and the first wave, quote unquote, first wave feminist movement on both sides of the Atlantic was concerned actually with the same thing. And this is something that marks the emergence of the fourth wave, according to the analysts that I agree with, which is a kind of a return to the first wave. And I would argue, against some analysts who say that there's too much ahistoricity, because right now there is a resurgence, and has been steadily, of women's marches and Kiev Pride also marching in the street in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. And there's a big difference between feminist activism on a global scale, if we make assumptions about a global wave or a global post-feminism, versus how we measure these things in their local context. And in my book, I take great care to give as much local context as I can. This is another painting by a different artist, Lesa Homenko, from Dacha Madonna series. Again, the woman's body being central here, and also the older generation of women in Ukraine. That there is quite a bit of, right now, interest in preserving continuity between different generations, as the generation which grew up under the Soviet era is, largely retiring from any positions of decision-making authority. The younger generation is, reinvestigating what those legacies mean. And again, some more images from the marches that take place largely in the streets. But I would like to, again, historicize what we are looking at here, and I will just switch over to my other notes. Just a moment. These are also images from the National Art Museum of Ukraine that I took when I was in Kiev in 2014. They are showing the items from then ousted President Yanukovych's estate that had been hoarded during his time in power, but the museum becomes a place, again, of the redistribution of not just the material items that had been shored up, but also the symbolic capital of the fact that theft and authoritarianism are and were still taking place in Ukraine. So scholars debate whether the activists who first established International Women's Day in Europe were acting in response to the women's struggle in New York after the fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, since the holiday was not established in the US despite its celebration. But others hold that these early developments, which then led to marches, arose through the working class struggle for the protection of textile workers in New York, women who found allies across class lines, with middle class and wealthy women fighting for the right to vote. This is important because the factor of class organizing in Ukraine in the 2000s became extremely important. There were feminist groups between both revolutions, like Feministyczna Ofensywa, organizing specifically around questions of hiring discrimination and also sexual discrimination in the workplace. For young people who did not grow up under socialism, but can recall the Orange Revolution from high school or college, this is a really interesting turn of events, because it's a preservation of the unique working class organizing strategies that the first wave feminists and the suffragists in the region were using, which is oftentimes thrown away as needing to be decommunized. However, the International Women's Day and the marches around it, also that took place in St. Petersburg in 1917, happened just before the Bolshevik Revolution. A lot of those early feminist activists wouldn't call themselves feminists, and some were indeed Bolsheviks. However, many of them did not directly tie Bolshevism to women's emancipation or women's education, including Olga Kobylianska and Lesa Ukrainka being a major national figure in Ukraine today. So the ambitious reforms that were promised by the Ord revolutionary leaders obviously disappeared in the second half of the 2000s when Yanukovych came to power. This is all the prologue to the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2014. Many women across the academic and professional sectors mobilized at that time around also equal representation in parliament. So International Women's Day, March 8th, and women's marches became a key cultural site for producing meaning that symbolically unified women from different classes, different sides of the political spectrum, and different cultural backgrounds, also being Russian speaking, Ukrainian speaking, Jewish, Tatar. It unified their petitions, their conferences, and their street demonstrations against what later, brutally showed us was an increasingly regressive regime. This moment really reveals something that scholars such as Catherine Verdery had been saying about the post-Soviet space more broadly, that conflicts over March 8th, for example, in this case, like conflicts over feminism in this local site, are really about how to commemorate a past regime, which parts to inherit from one's grandmother, and which ones to reject. In the foundational book, What Was Socialism and What Comes Next?, Catherine Verdery credits the important role that gender has played in post-Soviet political rhetoric to the ways that it was legislated under socialism. The woman question, like the national question, was presenting the Soviets with ideological risks to the regime as a vehicle for subversive counter-revolutionary views that were forbidden by the Politburo. But we're not in the Soviet period anymore. And where the socialist past has been thrown away in Ukraine as irrelevant or counterproductive by local policymakers, so too have many women's positive associations with some of the things that socialism brought to the women's movement, some of the gains. They have been tossed aside. Verdery cites statehood, state building as a culprit in this, because communist parties all across Eastern Europe, where they towed the Soviet internationalist line in public, national sentiment became a form of anti-communism. To the extent that women are seen as having benefited from socialism, as having had the socialist state as their ally, feminism becomes socialist and is attacked as anti-national. This has been a pattern in the ideology even after the Maidan Revolution into the present. And it's also the fuel for the semantics of the far right throughout Eastern Europe right now and in Poland. I want to refer to a recent talk by the scholar Agnieszka Graf, who spoke at University of Michigan a couple of weeks ago. And she was speaking there in a talk she entitled Gender Politics and the Populist Movement, Will the East Save the West? And she's thinking here about the relationship between the West and the post-communist context, which is useful for us working as scholars in the West. What is our role in all of this? How can our institutions and our work within them be made more responsible to the legacies that I am very proud of in working, for example, at University of Toronto, University of Michigan, University of Alberta, where dissidents and very clear and critical resistance to censorship in the 20th century gave the world the gift of a view on what censorship looks like in the East, but also in the West. So what is our role today, and how can we revisit those legacies for the context of anti-gender and fake news, to work against the disinformation and hold ourselves to task. Here's what Agnieszka Graf has to say about it. She's saying the specificity of the ideology of anti-gender campaigns in the Polish context is too often universalized by Western scholars, that anti-gender is not a Western, or it's not a universal thing. It takes different forms. And she argues is, she's at University of Warsaw, she argues is even more virulent in the Polish case right now than it is in America, but I disagree with her on that. But I do agree with her fully when she says she doesn't think that we should throw away the idea of post-colonial studies also within gender studies, that we need to think also about our hegemony and how this, attack that we're seeing in our own societies on, for example, critical race studies, being a term that appears as a target in authoritarian extremist groups, we need to hold ourselves in not attempting to speak for the post-Soviet case and gender development as something that we can heal or inoculate. We need to be better translators, and we need to be more sensitive to semantics and language, that we need to center the intersection of political analysis with gender. So I would say that in this framework, and also in what I've found in my book over 10 years, is that we are looking too much outside of our own context. So I studied the controversial group Femin, and I was very interested early on in talking to them firsthand about media, because they work a lot with media platforms, oftentimes performing their movement and as a dramaturgy to capture media attention, to capture cameras, to capture this all-seeing eye. And what I learned was that images of oppression circulate quite well in Western contexts. Here's an image, a World Press photo image of a sex worker from Kryvyi Rih. And you can see, obviously, this is a very emaciated representation of suffering of sex work as a predatory occupation, which is one side of a feminist debate, and there are other sides as well. But we can also look at other World Press photos from the same time. Here's one from Yemen, and it matches a painting by a Femin member, Oksana Brucovetska. So Femin is also coming up a lot in fourth wave feminist analysis at this intersection of East and West, because Femin is also neither West fully nor East fully. They are in this crossroads themselves, and feminism in Ukraine and gender in Ukraine has had to navigate oftentimes the feminine media phenomenon in the 2000s. The activists I was talking to in Ukraine have published texts with titles like "Why I Am Not Like Femin," "Why Feminism Is Not Femin Only." And what this says is that there's really, a powerful discourse at play in the Western gaze, looking at the East, and also looking even farther East through the performances that Femin had that were largely targeting the images of Middle Eastern women being very oppressed, even more oppressed than Femin, and Femin had staged themselves as somehow saving Middle Eastern women. So these degrees of oppression, these hierarchies, come through in the analysis of a media phenomenon that reveals, I think, less about Femin's actual ideas than it does about the West's fetish of itself, and also of others, and processes of othering within our information sphere. Here is another image of a Kiev Pride March in which you can see a drone at the top of the image. It's very small, but it's flying the rainbow flag in this particular photo that I took. I wrote a piece about this march and this particular presence of drones there for the Kennan Institute. And in that piece, I was writing that my observations in the march this year, which was 2019, were very different than the years prior. In the years prior, you could see more of a physical presence of the opposition, the anti-gender movement on the other side of the barricades. But in 2019, that physical opposition was largely absent, that there was an illusion of peaceful protest. But if you really start to investigate citations by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International on far-right extremist groups in Ukraine, they were just moving online, that things have become more digitized and more virtual. It doesn't necessarily mean they've become safer or more moderated. And Bellingcat is a wonderful group if anybody out there is researching these themes and is interested in really great analysis on extremist organizing and civil protests. Bellingcat does a great job at tracking far-right groups, and so does Citizen Lab at University of Toronto. But drones like this one in particular were being used by the activists, officially registered. This drone was registered with the march in order to enhance the march itself by flying a flag, obviously in solidarity with the marchers in a peaceful setting. So for us as academics, we are, in our occupations, not marching in the streets, but most of us, unless we're doing participant observation, and I would say we are, though, still really vital to this moment of information warfare or disinformation. But we need to clarify our terms of reference, both as a community of Ukrainian studies that is becoming more and more global. However, we have our different localities. There are so many Kievs. There are as many Kievs, there are as many Ukraines as there are scholars of Ukraines. But where is the consensus? What terms can we revisit, like gender and anti-gender, to bring them into a central focus? How can we organize our institutions to update them for the 21st century with more vital exchanges between them, so we don't end up siloed into different categories of supplementary information for research purposes, for example. So in this sense, gender is a central concept, not only for fourth wave feminists who are revisiting the first wave and suffragism today, and as we are around the world defending our democracy and defending our legitimacy of our elections. Not only is this the province of women, but it is a central concept for understanding so much more than checking boxes. It is the language by which the populists, the authoritarians are building platforms to confuse and to dismantle our institutions. So to drive home this point even further historiographically, if we look back today, we would not be able to understand for example, the ideological underpinnings of 1930s Germany without the word Jewish minority as a central component of the ideological architecture of fascism at the time. The semantics of today's fascism, if the idea of the Maidan, as I showed in this image, the beginning, so if the idea of the Maidan is patriotism and there is no propaganda and no fascism, and we have critical studies in all of our institutions, then we might actually come up with a vaccine for disinformation and for the breakdown of our ability to communicate and to translate between East and West in a way that does justice to different perspectives. The semantics of today's fascism organizes itself through signs and signified that function as memes, rapidly traveling through the media, often stating the very opposite of an action or the signified, as in Orwell's doublespeak of 1984. But this is just one of many strands within the umbrella of far-right populist organizing, and that particular organizing in collusion with security services and regimes around the globe that is particularly dangerous for Ukraine and Poland due to the facility with which the global narratives can deploy, co-opt, and manipulate the local valence of the terminology of fascism, for example, of Nazis and neo-Nazis, because in the local context, individuals lived through the 20th century in these territories. So that is why these places in the local really become loaded internationally and are so important for us in area studies and Ukrainian studies to consider very carefully and to unpack what doublespeak is. Doublespeak meets its opposite in double consciousness, which comes from, again, our American great letters, great people of letters, not only Audre Lorde, who I mentioned earlier, but of course, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, and a mentor of mine at Berkeley, Sadia Hartman. And double consciousness is the ability to move between different habitus, different ways of communication in order to survive. It is essentially a survival strategy that African Americans, and this is embodied in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, have assimilated into a way to protect their psychological sanity. And this is not totally new either to Ukraine, which is why I have really throughout my adult life continued to be compelled to return again and again and live and work in this region, because the history of the Soviet era there gave the world really a fine-tooth comb which to see ways of navigating creatively around censorship. And those marks of the censor end up being part of the artwork or part of the literary masterpiece. I'm thinking of Master and Margarita, for example, that offer us now in the world a new context or maybe an old one in which we can cast a new critical eye at what is oftentimes written about in mass media as completely new, that that Facebook has created the revolution when in fact people created the revolution, and that suffragists brought about emancipation when in fact the drafters of the Constitution brought about oppression. There are different ways of telling the story, but I think that the story itself is holding together. And I want to end on a little bit of a positive note. So we'll just read from my conclusion to my book before I open the floor for questions, because I would love to engage with all of you. So let's see. It is April 2014. I am standing on Kiev's Maidan at Easter time. Everything around me is scorched and covered in flowers. Handmade memorials and carefully arranged miniature displays of bullets and other debris labeled as evidence of what happened by the people still encamped on the Maidan stand outside the tents of this mostly people's encampment. It's a city within a city. From the middle of the square, I can see a graveyard, a church, a military training zone, a psychological ward, a hospital, a canteen, a press center, and a piano. Vibrantly colored drawings and paintings posted to the stone facades of Hrshatik's Stalin-era buildings and the gilt marble entrances of the metro flutter in the midday sun. A banner near the stadium reads, "A Polish sign of solidarity with Ukraine." Several people are bowed in prayer in front of Dynamo Stadium, the site of the barricades between the police and the demonstrators, where many lives were lost, the Heavenly Hundred, as they are known. Nebesnya Sotnya. Two priests dressed in black wave censers in a circular motion, and the smell of hickory burns beneath the cauldrons of gruel boiling on the back of a recuperated Soviet Red Army military vehicle. I join a small crowd in front of the university, Taras Shevchenko, to observe a demonstration by student union activists calling for educational reform. Someone in the crowd, I will learn many months later, would be physically attacked and hospitalized. I follow others as they travel in a group to the subway, protecting themselves. Individuals here are targeted regularly for speaking out against corrupt practices that continue to eat away at people's life opportunities. The students I speak with tell me there is no trust for the older generation. While participating in the women's marches, however, I learned something different. I observe how the size of the crowd has grown exponentially since I first come to Ukraine to research feminism in 2009. I also observe how the threat of the opposition, not only to those marching for gender justice, but also to minorities of other kinds outside of the context of the marches, has grown and shifted. I find myself wondering how there can be a future without building more solidarity with the help of my peers in addressing the conditions of speech that affect us all in the present. If the past 2 decades in Ukraine can provide scholars with any lessons, we can be sure that they will unfold in dialogue with the bold thinkers, scholars, artists, and mavericks of all stripes who have become visible and found their voices in Ukraine. It is this generation that spans the former Cold War divide. It is our ideas, and maybe our deviation from the legacies of the 20th century around the globe, that will determine the rest of this story. So thank you. And I look forward to hearing your questions, ideas, and responses.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for that great talk and for such an interesting overview of your own work and some really big picture ideas and questions. We have one question that's appeared in the Q&A function, and then I invite others to submit any questions you might have for Dr. Zukovic in the chat. The first question, the person writes, "Excellent talk." And it goes on to write, "My question is related to your apparent counterposition of feminism and gender rights movement versus the far right, which is not that popular in Ukraine politically. For example, there's less parliamentary representation of the far right than in Germany. The bigger problem this person sees is the role of the overall conservative post-colonial society that has not been properly educated. Could you please comment on this?"
Sure. So thank you. Yes. Just today, this morning, my colleague in Geneva, who is originally from Kiev, who's a feminist activist I've kept in touch with for many years, sent me a Facebook post that has been circulating this week about a PhD that was approved by the Ministry of Education. And this is by a scholar, a Ukrainian scholar in Ukraine, who's protesting this particular PhD and trying to draw attention to it because it uses vocabulary that she has listed out here, such as matriarchal racism, political homosexualism, matriarchal castration, woman, a textbook for men, things that, you know, just would not pass muster in a peer review process. And she's right to draw attention to this language as receiving, endorsement by the Ukrainian government. So in this sense, yeah, I think the problem, as you're pointing out, maybe we label as far right, but it's really far more pervasive and subtle, and that there is a kind of silence also that is not maybe what we would assume an active attack on gender or on racial minorities. And we have this problem in the US too, and in Canada as well, where women are just, you know, they're not given promotions, they're not hired equally. If there is a pregnancy or maternity leave, they often lose their jobs. If you look at the numbers of representation in Ukraine's parliament today, of women, they've gone up. Also with National Academy of Sciences, they've gone up in recent years, but they still are catastrophically low. And I know, like, in one of the most recent shocking, you know, figures that I had encountered, it was something like, you know, 10 out of all of the professors in National Academy of Sciences were women. So yes, the problem of the far right is a problem. We can study it almost, I think, symptomatically, because it may not be the mainstream or the majority view, but there is more pervasive issue with inequality pertaining to gender in Ukraine. And I also, in addition to just that Facebook post that I had encountered this morning, there is now the Human Rights Watch report for 2020, and includes a section on women. And it reads, the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected women, who account for over 80% of Ukraine's healthcare and social workers. The pandemic-related restrictions have led to a surge in domestic violence. Big surprise, that's what we have around the world now, with reported cases increasing by as much as 30%. According to service providers, victims were unable to escape abuse during the pandemic due to lack of shelter space and inadequate police response. February, President Volodymyr Zelensky pledged to submit to Council of Europe Convention on Prevention of Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, known as the Istanbul Convention, to Parliament for ratification, pending additional instructions by relevant ministries. And the government did sign that convention in 2011. So there is effort being made at the highest levels, I think, with regard to prevention of violence, which would directly, I think, put pressure on the anti-discrimination law being enforced in response to far-right attacks. There have also been hate crimes and attacks on Roma that would fall under that anti-discrimination law, which, as it exists now, is not effective.
Great, thank you for that answer. And while we wait for other questions to come in via the chat, I encourage anyone to ask Dr. Zukovic anything they'd like about the chat or her great book. But while we're waiting for that, I just wanted to ask a question about the way the activists you're looking at, the artists you're looking at, are engaging with the past. I was struck, you know, when we think about revolutions and revolutionaries, we think about a sort of radical remaking and you know, and a scrapping in many ways of the past. Certainly, this was the case with much of the way that the Bolsheviks went about their revolution, creating a radically new society. And your artists and activists seem to be, you know, drawing on and engaging the past in different ways. And I'm wondering, and also sort of engaging the idea of the generations that came before them that are still around, have, are sometimes written off as, not reformable because of their certain age or a certain set of experience. And I'm wondering, how you see that playing out. What kind of tensions are there between the idea of making something new and the idea of going back, and how is this generational idea playing out in what you're looking at?
Sure, sure. In my book, I have a chapter featuring wider discussion around this Ofensiva group, but it is also about the aesthetics of photography in works by Yevgenia Belorusets, but you can also see this in aesthetics that the culture makers of the generation that I'm looking at utilize from the Soviet era, that they're taking the forms of the early Soviet avant-garde and readapting them to their own statements about contemporary society, which has a few effects. And one is that we could say these artists are politically engaged artists, would be the word from art history. But how much to kind of impose on them in their work a political consensus is something I actually don't want to do, because that would be overlooking the legacies that I think they are trying to illustrate, which is a detachment from the regime today in order to illustrate continuities of control and censorship of the official culture that the Soviets, going back to the Bolsheviks, were really, organizing and instrumentalizing. The instrumentalizing of culture is something I think most artists want to get away from then and now, and unless we're looking at the official artists of the Soviet era, who even then were writing oftentimes in their private diaries and about the difficulties of working with the state. And in the early Soviet avant-garde in Ukraine, there was massive execution and persecution and targeting of artists in the early 30s, late 20s. And right now, because of the post-revolutionary moment Ukraine is in, there is a kind of opening up of those secret archives that were not accessible before. So we can look at figures from the early Soviet art period, like Mikhailo Boychuk, for example, or Olenka Pavlenko, who were targeted for expressing sentiments of Ukrainianness, of Ukrainian nationalism, nationalism being a danger. And Olenka Pavlenko also was really organizing and depicting March 8 marches. So she was part of, the woman question in her official sanctioning by the regime during her lifetime as an artist. She was like a represented, official, sanctioned artist, but later persecuted. So there's been some interesting exhibits in Ukraine recently. One of them I got to see in person and participate in as a lecturer, and it was called A Space of One's Own. This was in Kiev in late 2018 in November. And in that museum, curators and artists from throughout Ukraine brought contemporary works that they had made into conversation with works from the 20s and also late Soviet period, in a kind of investigation more than a statement of the history of the woman question through aesthetics. And I would say that this is also, it's interesting that this particular exhibit took place in Pinchuk Art Center, which is owned and managed by Viktor Pinchuk, the oligarch. Unfortunately, it is one of the only spaces that has been, pretty open to different expressions. There's been a lot of creative license allowed there. I am not in any way advocating on behalf of Pinchuk or oligarchy, but what I am saying is there is a lack of artist-run spaces in Ukraine. There's a lack of ownership over the means of one's production. So in this sense, it puts creative production into difficult zone where choices have to be made about how much to, attack a policy that one doesn't agree with, or work with the boundaries, within the boundaries that are there for making exhibits and doing artwork. And the artists are, in this sense, really becoming activists, whether they would label themselves that or not. They have put pressure on laws around censorship, and the photographer Yevgenia Belarusets in my book, or the painter Volodymyr Kuznetsov, have been in censorship cases for years. And that's an interesting part, I think, of the artistic context in Ukraine that we don't really have in the West in the same way. And it's what I think makes my book valuable for art history departments and not only Ukrainian studies in the US.
Great, thank you. We have another question that's come in, or maybe a comment that you might comment on yourself. The person writes, "What I've noticed in the last years is that finally scholars in the academic settings are becoming more amenable to either gender or at least women's studies. This has been a very difficult role. The Women's Center at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv is engaged in a very productive maneuvering of changing the understanding of traditional subjects, including religion and philosophy. I would urge a more active involvement of Western scholars with the actual institutions in Ukraine."
Thank you for this question. And I certainly know the work of Marta Bohachevsky-Homiak, who is cited throughout my book, the author of Feminists Despite Themselves, Women in Ukrainian Community Life, 1888 to 1939, for listeners out there. That's a very foundational work for the study of women and women's organizing in Ukraine. So thank you for this question. The idea that gender and women's activism can be put on a political spectrum is a fallacy that I think endangers women and endangers the institutions that have been built in order to close the gap of in all kinds of areas of society, the inequality gaps between women and other genders. And in this sense, conservative movements, conservative women's movements, I think should be at the table with all other stripes of feminism and discussions. And religion right now in Ukraine is a really important area to reinvestigate, of course, because of the schism that happened in the last couple of years with the Ukrainian patriarch, separating from Moscow, and to study the Ukraine-Russia conflict and to understand the country as a whole, we have to understand the role that religion and the church plays in women's lives from all different angles. And this is a case I'm also arguing for, moderation in our discussion in our institutions. We have to have neutrality. We have to have spaces of discussion that inoculate us against the pitting of gender, anti-gender, feminism as a cuss word, in social media and in propaganda, because those are, corporate invested media for-profit discussions, whereas our, you say, more engagement with institutions in Ukraine. I think we definitely need to be always working with the anti-corruption efforts in attracting more scholars to work with more institutions in Ukraine by always, working for that neutrality, working to keep out corporate for-profit agendas, and that is an ongoing issue everywhere, where we have to think about academic freedom and still be beholden somewhat to the democracies, the wider society we live in. There's no ivory tower, of course, but yeah, I think it is great. And UKU is fantastic in their work. I know they have supported Oksana Keys, who was the person who drafted the letter I was referring to earlier that sparked the March 8 march in 2011, which has since grown to thousands of people. So it's great that she is there also kind of carrying the torch for gender studies, and hopefully we will see more, and not only gender studies, anthropology and the traditional disciplines that she works in as well. So hopefully we will see more and more discussion around these issues, not only in Kiev Mohyla and UKU, but other areas of Ukraine. I'm giving a talk at Kharkiv University in a couple of weeks, and they have a partnership now with UNESCO. So that's also another thing that can be done, working with multilateral organizations to help buffer some of the agendas or interests that maybe put pressure on scholars and their right to academic freedom in Ukraine, so they don't come under attack for talking about gender rights or feminism.
Great, thank you for that. I suppose following up on Dr. Bohachevsky-Khomyak's question, and something to something you said at the very beginning, which is how you see your role as a translator and how you're positioning yourself as a U.S. trained, Canada-based scholar of global Ukrainian feminist activism and art, and as part of a movement that is indeed global. And I'm kind of curious, what this, how you came upon this metaphor of translation, and what, if we're going to sort of follow that metaphor, what things have you found particularly difficult to translate, or what things have you found untranslatable, and how are you sort of exploring and playing with this concept and dealing with activists and artists who are perhaps increasingly aware of the Western gaze, as you brought up the feminine example as one example of people who are sort of aware of being seen and also framing certain things. You talked about representations of Muslim women, in a certain way. So I'm kind of curious if you could just riff on this idea of being a translator, how that's sort of challenged you, and what challenges you face in that role, and how you came to think of yourself that way.
Mm-hmm. So my early days in forming this project and drafting this project really happened in an interdisciplinary setting at University of Michigan, working with literary scholars, sociologists focused on Belarus, Lena Gapova, historian of Poland, and a film scholar. So I was kind of early on really translating between disciplines in speaking to these different mentors of mine. And then I was also really working with the long legacy there at University of Michigan too, of Roman Sporluk, John Paul Himka, and the Polish studies there, Michael Kennedy, the sociologist of intellectuals. And one of my dissertation committee members who helped me kind of work out some ideas very early was Benjamin Palij, who is himself a translator and has been for a long time working on these ideas of the figure of the male dissident, and now he is, thinking more about gender in this project, but before it was just the figure of the dissident from Eastern Europe and how it's constructed in the West, and how oftentimes, in letters like Joseph Brodsky, who was at University of Michigan, and also Asia Humetsky, the literary figure from Ukraine, the construction of an author is different than the construction of a dissident, but they do cross and intersect in the West when they're coming from Eastern Europe in a way that kind of reveals the production of celebrity at the root of politics, that every politician is an orator and to some degree, performing their politics. And this performativity is where I really have anchored my vocabulary in my translation between not just, spoken languages, English and Ukrainian and Polish being the main ones that I've worked in for this project, but also in co-constructing a new language for the performativity of gender and protest that my colleagues in Ukraine, to include some of them who are now here with me at Canadian Institute of Ukraine Studies this year, Olha Plahodnik and Maria Majerczyk being two of many, that we are bringing about a language as we are, trying to understand each other's societies. That, in 2011, the world saw, after Arab Spring, a lot of, use actually of nudity as a form of protest. This was new. There was also Pussy Riot in Russia, and suddenly there were these like celebrities, again, celebrity dissidents, but constructed differently than they were in the 20th century, because there are different tools for the production to include new technology, and digital protest features in 2 chapters out of 5 in my book. And I, really think that the field of, digital protest and digital humanities is broad, but I worked quite a bit also with Jesse Labov, who has written about samizdat, and samizdat in terms of the digital protests that I'm talking about in the early 2000s, kind of the other side of Pussy Riot and Femin within Ukraine is, I think, what my interlocutors and I found ourselves translating that we didn't expect we would have to translate, that we thought we would already have these kind of ready-made tools for discussing identity, politics, but everything changed in 2012 when the world's attention and the media and all the cameras were suddenly on, Yulia Tymoshenko's jail, hunger strike, and Oleg Sentsov and Alex Navalny, and all these figures now that we suddenly found ourselves working within the context of, that we needed a new language with which to show the world that actually there are a lot of other forms of protests that are kind of happening around these figures that maybe are not as legible by the West, because they don't have that celebrity architecture to the semantics of their performance, but they're important, really important nonetheless. Oksana Brucovetska is a figure I'm thinking about, who has done wonderful, amazing things for feminism in Ukraine on all levels since the 90s. And she's in my book, and she's very active today, writing and making art. So I hope that this book will bring attention to others, and it already is. I really am excited about my colleagues' books that are going to be published in the next few years. Olga Plahodnik, Emily Channel Justice, I can think of more names, Natalia Chermalek. You're going to see a lot more publications on these themes. written in English and published on university presses, and that's very exciting.
Great, yeah, and I can definitely confirm, having read your book, I mean, I've learned a lot about many people whose work I was less familiar with, and so I think, I recommend to everyone out there who hasn't had a chance to pick up a copy, and sort of, I love this idea of going beyond the, those with sort of a celebrity infrastructure, or who can sort of, gain celebrity because of framing that, perhaps more readily translates, but might not, provide the same sort of meaning, or address some of the same issues, some of the issues that you're looking at. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So I wanted to thank Jessica Zukovic for a wonderful talk and for sharing her birthday, a part of her birthday, with us. And I hope let's all join together virtually and thanking her for the talk and sending her the warmest of birthday wishes in Canada.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And yes, do pobачення.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you to all of you who've come today. Hope to see you at our future events this semester. And again, check the link in the chat to Jessica's book. If you don't have it already, I highly recommend it.
Thank you.